That humid August afternoon when I woke up on the cold kitchen floor with blood on my lip and my stepfather standing over me adjusting his belt was the moment I realized that some monsters don't hide under beds. They live in the same house as you, wearing the mask of a protector. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thompson, and I'm 87 years old now. Most folks here in Cedar Falls, Ohio, know me as the sweet old lady who bakes apple pies for the church fundraisers and tends to the most beautiful rose garden on Maple Street. When they look at me, they see wrinkled hands that shake slightly. When I pour tea, silver hair always neatly pinned back, and eyes that seem to twinkle with the wisdom that comes from a long life well lived. But if you could look deeper, past the gentle smile and the soft-spoken words, you'd see scars that time, never quite healed. You'd see a story that began in 1945, when I was just 7 years old and the world was celebrating the end of a terrible war, while my own personal war was just beginning. I was born in the spring of 1938 in a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. Back then, our town was even smaller than it is now. Just a few hundred people who all knew each other's business, or thought they did. Our house sat on 5 acres of land that my father, James Mitchell, had inherited from his own father. It wasn't much to look at. A simple 2-story wooden structure with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that creaked in the wind. But to me, it was paradise. We had chickens pecking around the yard, a vegetable garden where Mama grew, the biggest tomatoes in the county, and an old apple tree that I loved to climb. From the highest branch, I could see clear across the fields to where the Hendersons lived, and sometimes I'd wave to their daughter Lucy, who was about my age. My father was a quiet man with gentle hands and eyes the color of summer sky. He worked at the grain elevator in town, coming home each evening with dust in his hair and the smell of wheat on his clothes. I have vivid memories of him lifting me up to pick apples from our tree, his deep laugh rumbling in his chest when I'd squeal with delight. He called me his little sparrow because I was small for my age and always chirping about something or other. Mama, her name was Rose, was the most beautiful woman in Cedar Falls, at least in my young eyes. She had auburn hair that caught the sunlight like fire, and when she smiled, which was often in those early days, it was like the whole room got brighter. She smelled like vanilla and lavender, scents that still make me think of safety and love, even now, all these years later. Our life was simple but happy. We didn't have much money, but we had each other, and that seemed like everything a little girl could need. Sunday mornings we'd walk to the white clapboard church in town, Mama in her best blue dress and me in the yellow one she'd sewn by hand. After service, we'd have lunch at the diner with some of the other families, and I'd color pictures on napkins while the adults talked about weather and crops and things that seemed important to grown-ups. In the evenings, after supper and dishes were done, Papa would read to me from a book of fairy tales while Mama mended clothes or worked on her embroidery. I believed in happy endings then. I believed that good people were rewarded and bad people were punished, that mothers and fathers would always protect their children, and that love could conquer anything. The first crack in that perfect world came on a Tuesday in March of 1945. I remember it was Tuesday because Mama always did the washing on Tuesdays, and she was hanging sheets on the line when Mrs. Kowalski from down the road came running up our driveway, her face white as the laundry flapping in the wind. There had been an accident at the grain elevator. A conveyor belt had malfunctioned, and Papa had been caught in the machinery. He was rushed to the hospital in Columbus, but the doctors said there was nothing they could do. Internal injuries, they called them, though I was too young to understand what that meant. All I knew was that my Papa, my gentle giant who made me feel safe in the world, was gone. The funeral was the first time I'd ever seen Mama cry. She stood, beside the grave in her black dress, the only black dress she owned, borrowed from a neighbor, holding my hand so tight it almost hurt. I kept expecting Papa to sit up in that wooden box and tell us it was all a mistake, that he was fine, that we could go home and have Sunday pancakes and everything would be normal again. But he didn't sit up. They lowered him into the ground while the preacher said words about heaven and eternal rest, and I realized that sometimes the people you love most just disappear, and there's nothing you can do to bring them back. After Papa died, everything changed. The life insurance policy he'd had through his job was small, barely enough to cover the funeral expenses. Mama tried to keep us going on the farm, but she'd never worked outside the home before, and the skills that made her a wonderful wife and mother didn't translate to paying jobs in a small town in 1945. She took in laundry, cleaned houses for the wealthier families in town, and sold vegetables from our garden at the farmer's market on Saturdays. I watched her hands, which had once been soft and smooth, become red and rough from lye soap and scrub brushes. I watched, the light in her eyes dim a little more each day as the bills piled up and the worry lines deepened around her mouth. I tried to help as much as a 7-year-old could. I fed the chickens, gathered eggs, helped tend the garden. I learned to be quiet when Mama was tired, to entertain myself when she was busy, to not ask for things we couldn't afford. Childhood, I was learning, was a luxury we could no longer afford. It was during this difficult time that Frank Peterson entered our lives. He owned Peterson's hardware store on Main Street, one of the most successful businesses in town. Frank was a big man, probably 6'3", with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could crush rocks. He had dark hair that he kept slicked back with pomade, and brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He started showing up at our house in the evenings, always with some excuse. He'd heard Mama needed help fixing a loose board on the porch. He had extra vegetables from his own garden that would just go to waste. He'd brought candy for me, peppermints that came in a little striped bag from his store. At first, Mama was hesitant to accept his help. She was proud, my Mama, and taking charity didn't come easy to her. But Frank was persistent and kind, and seemed genuinely concerned about our welfare. He never made her feel small or helpless, never acted like his help came with strings attached. "It's what neighbors do, Rose," he'd say in that deep voice of his. "Your James would have done the same for me if our situations were reversed." Slowly, Mama began to relax around him. She'd invite him to stay for supper, and he'd regale us with stories from the hardware store, funny tales about customers who didn't know a Phillips head screwdriver from a flathead, or the time old Mr. Jenkins tried to return a hammer he'd bought in 1923 because it wasn't working right anymore. I liked Frank in those early days. He treated me like I mattered, asked about school, remembered things I'd told him. When I mentioned that I missed having someone read to me at bedtime, he started bringing children's books from the lending library. When I complained that my bike had a flat tire, he fixed it without being asked. "Every little girl needs a bicycle." "That works," he said, ruffling my hair in a way that reminded me, just a little, of Papa. It was Frank who suggested that Mama start working at his hardware store. Business was good, he said, and he could use help with the books and inventory. The pay would be steady, better than what she could make taking in laundry, and she'd have regular hours instead of being at the beck and call of demanding customers. Mama was hesitant at first. What would people think, a widow working for an unmarried man? But Frank assured her that Mrs. Hartwell, the preacher's wife, had already offered to watch me after school until Mama could pick me up. Everything was arranged, everything was proper. And so, in the fall of 1945, Mama started working at Peterson's hardware store. She'd leave the house at 8 in the morning, looking pretty in the new dresses Frank had helped her buy. Business. Attire, he called it. Though they were nicer than anything she'd owned even when Papa was alive. She'd kiss me goodbye. promising to be home by 6 with stories about her day and maybe a piece of candy from the jar Frank kept by the cash register. For a while, it seemed like our luck had finally turned. Mama was happier than she'd been since Papa died. She hummed while she cooked dinner, bought me new school clothes without that pinched look of worry she'd worn for months. We even got a telephone installed, a luxury that made me feel important when I answered it with a grown-up voice. Mitchell residence, Margaret speaking. Frank became a regular fixture in our lives, joining us for Sunday dinner, helping with repairs around the house, bringing little gifts that made our modest home feel more comfortable. A new radio so we could listen to programs in the evening. A warm coat for me when winter came. Small things, but they added up to a feeling of security I hadn't experienced since Papa died. I was too young then to see the pattern that was forming, too innocent to understand that sometimes kindness can be a trap, that generosity can come with a price that's higher than anyone should have to pay. I was just a little girl who was grateful to have a man in the house again, someone who made Mama smile and who seemed to care about what happened to us. But looking back now, with the wisdom that comes from surviving what I survived, I can see how carefully it was all orchestrated. How Frank positioned himself as our savior, made us dependent on his goodness, his protection, his presence in our lives. I can see how he isolated us, little by little, from other people who might have noticed things, asked questions, intervened when intervention was desperately needed. Because what I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly have understood at 7 years old, was that Frank Peterson wasn't the answer to our prayers. He was the beginning of a nightmare that would shape the rest of my childhood and leave scars that I carry to this day. But that part of the story, the part where the mask came off and the monster revealed himself, that comes later. First, there were months of preparation, of trust building, of making us believe that we were lucky to have him in our lives. Months where I actually looked forward to his visits, where I felt safe in his presence, where I called him Uncle Frank and meant it with all the innocent affection of a child who had lost her father and was desperate for someone to fill that void. The trap was set so carefully, so patiently, that by the time we realized we were caught, it was already too late to escape. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first sign that something wasn't quite right came on a snowy December evening in 1945, about 3 months after Mama had started working at the hardware store. I remember it so clearly because it was the night everything began to change, though I wouldn't understand the significance until much later. Mama had been working late, doing inventory with Frank before the Christmas rush. Mrs. Hartwell had fed me supper and helped me with my arithmetic homework before walking me home around 7 o'clock. Our house felt different when it was empty, bigger somehow, and full of shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I had just gotten into my nightgown and was brushing my teeth when I heard Frank's truck pull into our driveway. Through the bathroom window, I could see Mama getting out of the passenger side, laughing at something he'd said. But when Frank stepped out of the driver's side, something about his movement seemed different. Slower. More deliberate. The way he looked at our house, at the warm yellow light spilling from the windows, made me feel uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. They came inside together, and I could hear their voices from the kitchen. Mama's bright and cheerful, Frank's deeper and somehow more intense than usual. I finished brushing my teeth and padded downstairs to say goodnight, the way I always did when Frank brought Mama home from work. "There's my little sparrow," Mama said, using Papa's old nickname for me. She held out her arms, and I ran to her, breathing in that familiar scent of vanilla and lavender that always made me feel safe. But when I looked over at Frank, something in his expression made me step closer to Mama. He was watching us with an intensity that seemed inappropriate for such an ordinary moment. His eyes lingered on me in a way that made my skin crawl, though I didn't have words for what I was feeling then. "Margaret's getting so grown up," he said, his voice carrying a note I'd never heard before. Not such a little girl anymore. I was, 8 years old and barely 4 feet tall. I was absolutely still a little girl, and his comment made no sense. But Mama just smiled and ruffled my hair. "She's my baby," she said. "She'll always be my baby." Frank's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course she will. Rose, you're such a good mother. Margaret's lucky to have you." There was something in the way he said it that felt like a warning, though I couldn't understand why. Looking back now, I think he was already beginning the process of isolating us, making Mama feel like he was the only one who truly appreciated her, who understood how hard she worked to take care of me. That night, after Frank left, I had trouble falling asleep. I kept thinking about the way he'd looked at me, the strange tone in his voice. When I finally did drift off, I had dreams about Papa, who seemed to be trying to tell me something important, but his voice was too far away for me to understand the words. The next few weeks passed normally enough, but I started noticing small changes in Frank's behavior. He began finding reasons to come by the house when Mama wasn't there, claiming he needed to check on a repair he'd done, or bringing by something he'd forgotten to give her at work. Mrs. Hartwell was usually with me during these visits, so nothing inappropriate happened, but I could feel him watching me when he thought no one was looking. He also started asking me personal questions that made me uncomfortable. What did I like to do when I was alone? Did I ever get lonely when Mama was at work? Was I happy living in such a big house with just the two of us? The questions seemed innocent enough on the surface, but something about the way he asked them, the intense way he listened to my answers, made me feel like I was being studied. Christmas that year was different too. Frank insisted on playing Santa Claus for me, showing up Christmas morning with a pile of presents that were far more expensive than anything Mama could have afforded. A beautiful doll with real hair and eyes that opened and closed. A set of books about horses. A music box that played for Elise when you opened the lid. "Frank, this is too much," Mama protested, but she was smiling as she said it, pleased by his generosity. "Nothing's too much for my girls," he replied, and the possessive way he said "my girls" made something cold settle in my stomach. After we opened presents, Frank stayed for Christmas dinner. Mama had made a small turkey with all the fixings, and the three of us sat around our kitchen table like a family. Frank carved the turkey with the precision of someone who was used to being in charge, serving Mama first, then me, then himself. "This is how it should be," he said, looking around the table with satisfaction. A man, his woman, and their child, sharing a meal in their own home. Mama blushed at being called his woman, but she didn't correct him. I wanted to point out that this wasn't his home, that I wasn't his child, but something about the atmosphere at the table made me keep quiet. There was a tension underneath the surface joviality, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air feels heavy and charged. After dinner, while Mama was doing dishes, Frank pulled me aside. "I have something special for you," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small wrapped package. "But this is just between us, understand? It's our secret." I knew I wasn't supposed to keep secrets from Mama, but Frank was an adult, and I'd been taught to respect adults. I nodded and took the package, unwrapping it to find a delicate silver locket on a thin chain. "It belonged to my mother," Frank said, fastening it around my neck. His fingers brushed against my skin as he worked the clasp, and I had to force myself not to pull away. "She would have wanted you to have it." The locket was beautiful, but wearing it felt wrong somehow. It was too heavy, too grown up for an 8-year-old. And the fact that he wanted it to be a secret between us made me uncomfortable. "Why can't I tell Mama?" I asked. Frank's hand settled on my shoulder, his grip just a little too firm. "Because sometimes grown-ups worry about things they don't need to worry about. Your Mama works so hard, she has so much on her mind. This little gift is just between us, okay? It shows that you and I have a special friendship. I nodded, though every instinct I had was telling me that something was wrong. I tucked the locket under my dress and didn't mention it to Mama, though keeping the secret felt like swallowing something bitter. After Christmas, Frank's behavior became more overtly inappropriate, though so gradually that it was hard to pinpoint exactly when things crossed the line. He started insisting on tucking me into bed when he stayed for dinner, a ritual that had always been Mama's alone. He would sit on the edge of my bed, asking about my day, my dreams, my fears, his hand resting on my leg over the covers. "You can. Tell Uncle Frank anything," he would say. "I'm here to take care of you and your mama. You know that, don't you?" I would nod, because what else could I do? But his presence in my bedroom felt like a violation, even when he wasn't doing anything. Obviously wrong. The way he looked at me, the way his voice dropped to a whisper when we were alone, the way he seemed to linger longer each time. It all made me want to hide under my covers until he left. He also started what he called wrestling with me. In the living room, pinning me down on the carpet while Mama was in the kitchen or the bathroom. It was supposed to be playful, the kind of roughhousing that uncles do with their nieces, but it felt different. He would hold me down longer than necessary. His breathing would change, and he would make comments about how I was getting stronger and filling out. "Frank's just being playful," Mama would say if she caught the tail end of these sessions. "It's good for Margaret to have a man around to play with her like that. She misses her father." But I didn't miss Papa in Frank's hands. When Papa used to play with me, I felt safe and loved. When Frank pinned me to the floor, I felt trapped and confused, like I wanted to scrub my skin until it was raw. The worst part was that I couldn't articulate what was wrong. Frank never touched me inappropriately during these early months. He never said anything that was explicitly sexual or threatening. Everything he did could be explained away as normal adult behavior, the actions of a kind man who was trying to be a father figure to a girl who had lost her real father. But children have instincts that adults often dismiss, and every instinct I had was screaming that Frank Peterson was dangerous. The problem was that all the adults in my life saw him as our savior. Mrs. Hartwell would comment on how lucky Mama and I were to have such a generous man looking out for us. The preacher would praise Frank's Christian charity during Sunday sermons. Even the other children at school, whose parents shopped at Peterson's Hardware, would tell me how nice Mr. Peterson was, how he always gave them free peppermints when they came in with their fathers. I started having trouble sleeping, lying awake, at night listening for the sound of Frank's truck in our driveway. When I did sleep, I had nightmares, vague, disturbing dreams where I was running through dark woods while something with Frank's voice called my name from behind the trees. My grades at school began to slip. I had always been a good student, but suddenly I couldn't concentrate during lessons. I would stare out the window, my mind elsewhere, until Miss Patterson would call my name sharply and ask me to pay attention. "Is everything all right at home, Margaret?" she asked me one day after class. "You seem distracted lately." I wanted to tell her about Frank, about the way he made me feel, about the secret locket hidden under my dress and the wrestling matches. That felt wrong in the way he looked at me when Mama wasn't watching. But how could I explain something I didn't understand myself? How could I complain about a man who was feeding us, clothing us, keeping us in our home? "Everything's fine, Miss Patterson," I lied, and saw the concern in her eyes deepen. At home, Mama was too busy and too grateful to notice the changes in my behavior. She was working long hours at the hardware store, trying to prove herself worthy of Frank's continued employment. In the evenings, she was often tired, focused on cooking dinner and managing the household, and she was falling in love. I could see it in the way she looked at Frank, the way she laughed at his jokes, the way she took extra care with her appearance, on mornings when she knew she'd be working closely with him. She was a young woman, barely 26, who had been widowed and struggling to survive. Frank represented security, stability, and the possibility of happiness again. I couldn't compete with that. I was just a child whose fears and discomfort seemed irrational compared to the concrete benefits Frank brought to our lives. So I kept quiet, swallowed my unease, and tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, but I wasn't imagining anything. As winter turned to spring, Frank's behavior became more aggressive, more possessive. He started making comments about how I needed a firm hand to guide me, how I was becoming willful, and needed to learn proper respect for authority. "Margaret's been getting a little too sassy lately," he would tell Mama. "She needs to understand that when a man tells her to do something, she does it without argument." I hadn't been sassy at all. I had been quiet and obedient, probably more so than most 8-year-olds. But Frank was laying groundwork, creating a narrative where I was a problem child who needed correction, a difficult girl who required his special attention to keep her in line, and Mama, trusting and grateful and increasingly dependent on Frank's approval, began to see me through his eyes. When I was slow to comply with his requests, she would give me sharp looks. When I showed any reluctance to spend time alone with him, she would lecture me about gratitude and respect. "Frank has been so good to us," she would say. "The least you can do is be polite and appreciative. He's trying to be a father to you, Margaret. You need to let him." But I didn't want Frank to be my father. I wanted my real papa back. The gentle man who smelled like wheat and called me his little sparrow. I wanted the life we'd had before, when it was just Mama and me and we didn't need anyone else to be happy. Unfortunately, what I wanted didn't matter anymore. Frank Peterson had inserted himself into our lives so completely, so skillfully, that by the spring of 1946, we couldn't imagine surviving without him. And that dependence, that gratitude, that desperate need for his continued support was exactly what he had been counting on. Because Frank Peterson wasn't the good man everyone thought he was. He was a predator who had identified a vulnerable target and spent months patiently setting his trap. And now that the trap was set, now that we were completely under his control, he was ready to reveal his true nature. The real nightmare was about to begin. The first time Frank Peterson touched me inappropriately was on a humid Tuesday in June, 1946. I remember the date because it was the day after my 9th birthday, and Mama had taken the morning off work to make me a special breakfast, pancakes shaped like flowers with strawberry syrup. It should have been a happy memory, but it's forever tainted by what happened later that same day. Mama had to go back to work that afternoon because the store was expecting a large shipment of farming equipment, and Frank needed her help with the paperwork. She arranged for me to spend the day at Mrs. Henderson's house, Lucy's mother, which I was looking forward to. Lucy and I had plans to play with her new paper dolls and maybe walk down to Miller's Creek to look for frogs. But an hour after, Mama left for work. Frank appeared at the Hendersons' front door with a story about how there had been a change of plans. Mrs. Henderson needed to go help her sister, who had suddenly taken ill, and Frank had volunteered to watch me for the rest of the day. "Rose asked me to pick Margaret up," he told Mrs. Henderson, his voice carrying that tone of helpful authority that people in town had grown to respect. "She's worried about imposing on your kindness, especially with your family emergency." Mrs. Henderson looked flustered and grateful. Her sister had indeed called about feeling poorly, though she hadn't asked for help. But Frank's offer seemed like a godsend, one less thing to worry about. "Are you sure it's no trouble, Frank?" she asked, already reaching for her hat and purse. "Margaret's such a good girl, but I hate to burden you when you've got the store to run." "No burden at all," Frank assured her, his hand settling on my shoulder in what looked like a paternal gesture. "Margaret and I are old friends, aren't we, sweetheart?" I wanted to tell Mrs. Henderson that I'd rather stay with Lucy, that Mama hadn't mentioned anything about Frank picking me up, that something felt wrong about the whole situation. But I was 9 years old, and I'd been raised to be polite to adults, not to question their decisions or make a fuss. So I said goodbye to Lucy, promising to play with the paper dolls another day, and climbed into Frank's truck. The vinyl seats were hot from sitting in the sun, and they stuck to my bare legs uncomfortably. Frank climbed in beside me, larger than life in the confined space, his presence overwhelming in a way that made me want to press myself against the passenger door. "Where are we going?" I asked as he started the engine. "Are we going to the store to see Mama?" Frank's smile was different than usual, sharper somehow, with an edge that made my stomach clench with uneasiness. "Not right away," he said. "I thought we'd go to my house first. I have something special to show you, something just for big girls like you." Frank lived alone in a large house on the outskirts of town, set back from the road and surrounded by tall oak trees that blocked it from view of the neighbors. I had never been inside before. When he visited us, it was always at our house, and when Mama worked late, he always drove her straight home. The house was bigger than ours, but somehow felt smaller, more cramped. The rooms were dark, with heavy curtains that blocked out most of the sunlight. The furniture was old and masculine, leather chairs, dark wood tables, and hunting trophies mounted on the walls. It smelled like pipe tobacco and something else I couldn't identify, something that made my nose wrinkle with distaste. "Welcome to my home, Margaret," Frank said, closing the front door behind us with a decisive click. The sound of the lock turning made me jump, though I couldn't say why it frightened me so much. "What did you want to show me?" I asked, staying close to the door, every instinct telling me that I needed to be ready to run. Frank's eyes had taken on that intense quality I'd noticed before, but now there was no one else around to witness it, no need for him to hide his true nature. "Patience, little bird," he said, using a nickname I'd never heard before. "First, why don't you come sit with me on the couch? We need to have a conversation about your future." He patted the couch beside him, but I remained standing near the door. Something in his tone, in the way he was looking at me, triggered every alarm bell in my young mind. "I think I'd like to go see Mama now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "She's probably wondering where I am." Frank's expression darkened. "Your Mama is exactly where she's supposed to be, working hard to earn the money I pay her. Money that keeps food on your table and a roof over your head. Money that you should be grateful for her." The shift in his tone was sudden and frightening. Gone was the jovial Uncle Frank who brought candy and fixed broken things around our house. In his place was a man whose voice carried a threat that made my blood run cold. "I am grateful," I whispered, taking a step backward toward the door. "Are you?" Frank stood up, and suddenly the room felt much smaller. "Because your behavior lately suggests otherwise. The way you pull away when I try to show you affection. The way you look at me like I'm some kind of monster. Is that gratitude, Margaret?" I didn't know how to answer. I couldn't explain that my instincts screamed danger every time he was near, that his touches felt wrong even when they seemed innocent, that there was something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. "I want to go home," I said, my voice barely audible. Frank moved closer, and I could smell that strange scent more strongly now, something sour and predatory that made me want to gag. "This is what's going to happen," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "You're going to stop being ungrateful. You're going to start appreciating everything I've done for you and your mother. And you're going to learn what it means to show proper respect to the man who takes care of you." He reached out and grabbed my wrist, his fingers wrapping around it like a manacle. His grip was firm but not painful, yet, but the implied threat was clear. "Let me go," I said, trying to pull away, but his hold tightened. "You'll go when I say you can go," Frank replied. "Right now, you and I are going to get better acquainted. You're not a little girl anymore, Margaret. It's time you learned some adult lessons." What happened next is difficult for me to talk about, even after all these years. Frank forced me to sit beside him on that leather couch, his arm around my shoulders like a vice, holding me in place when I tried to move away. He told me that this was what happened in families, that this was how men showed love to the special girls in their lives. His hands roamed where they had no right to be, and when I tried to cry out, he clamped his other hand over my mouth, his fingers pressing into my cheeks hard enough to leave bruises. "Shh," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "Good girls don't make noise. Good girls understand that. This is our special secret. You want to be a good girl, don't you, Margaret?" I couldn't speak with his hand over my mouth, but tears were streaming down my face, and my whole body was shaking with terror and revulsion. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. Adults were supposed to protect children, not hurt them. Men who claimed to love your mother weren't supposed to do things that made you feel dirty and afraid. When he finally released me, I was gasping for air, my face wet with tears and my whole body trembling like a leaf in a storm. Frank smoothed down my hair and adjusted my dress as if nothing had happened, his movements casual and practiced. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" he said, his voice returning to that false kindness he used when others were around. "Now you understand how things are going to be between us. This is our special relationship, Margaret. Just yours and mine." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to tell him that he was sick and wrong and that I would tell everyone what he had done. But when I opened my mouth, the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stare at him in shocked silence while he outlined the rules of my new reality. "Your mama can never know about this," he continued, straightening his own clothes, with the same casual efficiency. "If you tell her, she won't believe you. Why would she? I'm the man who saved you both from poverty and homelessness. I'm the man who gives her a job, who pays her wages, who keeps you fed and housed. Who do you think she'll believe? Me or a confused little girl who might be making up stories?" He was right, and we both knew it. Mama trusted Frank completely. She depended on him for everything. If I told her what had just happened, she would think I was lying, or confused, or seeking attention. She might even be angry with me for saying such terrible things about the man who had been so good to us. "And even if she did believe you," Frank continued, "what do you think would happen then? I'd have to fire her, of course. I couldn't keep someone around who was spreading lies about me. You'd lose your home. I own the land it sits on, did you know that? Your mother signed it over as collateral for a loan last month, so you'd be homeless and penniless, and it would be all your fault." The room spun around me as the full scope of my trap became clear. Frank hadn't just been grooming me. He'd been systematically removing every avenue of escape, every source of help or protection. We weren't just dependent on his kindness anymore. We were completely under his control. "But that's not going to happen," Frank said, his tone brightening as if he was discussing the weather. "Because you're a smart girl, and smart girls understand how the world works. You're going to keep our secret, and in return, your mama gets to keep her job, and you get to keep your home. Everyone stays happy and safe. Doesn't that sound nice?" I nodded, because what choice did I have? But inside, something fundamental had broken. The world I thought I knew, where adults protected children and love meant safety, had shattered like glass. In its place was a new reality where silence meant survival, where the price of my family's security was paid with my innocence. Frank drove me back to Mrs. Henderson's house an hour later, arriving just as she was returning from her sister's. He spun a story about how we'd gone to the hardware store so I could help him organize some inventory, how I'd been such a good helper, that he'd treated me to ice cream afterward. "She's a treasure, this one," he told Mrs. Henderson, ruffling my hair in that paternal way that now made my skin crawl. "You should be proud of how well-behaved she is. Not many children her age are so mature and understanding." Mrs. Henderson beamed at the praise, and Lucy ran out to greet me with excitement about the paper dolls we could finally play with. I smiled and nodded and pretended to be interested, but everything felt distant and unreal, like I was watching someone else's life through a thick pane of glass. When Mama picked me up that evening, Frank was waiting with her in Mrs. Henderson's driveway. He helped me into the truck with what looked like normal courtesy, but when his hand briefly touched mine, I had to fight not to flinch away. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Mama asked as we drove home. "Mrs. Henderson said Frank took you to help at the store. That was nice of him, wasn't it?" "Yes, Mama," I said, staring out the window at the familiar streets that somehow looked different now, darker and more threatening than they had that morning. "Frank says you were very helpful," she continued, smiling at him in the rearview mirror. "He says you're growing up to be quite the young lady." "She certainly is," Frank agreed, and I could feel his eyes on me even though I refused to look at him. "Margaret and I understand each other very well now. Don't we, Margaret?" "Yes, sir," I whispered, the words tasting like poison in my mouth. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my body still feeling wrong and alien, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I could hear Mama and Frank talking quietly in the kitchen below, their voices mixing with the normal sounds of evening, dishes clinking, the radio playing softly, the comfortable sounds of a family settling in for the night. But I wasn't part of that family anymore. I was something else now. A secret keeper, a victim, a little girl who had learned too early that monsters don't always hide under beds. Sometimes they sit at your kitchen table and carve your turkey on Christmas Day, and this was only the beginning. Frank had made that clear. This wasn't a one-time thing, a moment of weakness or poor judgment. This was my new reality, the price I would pay every day for my family's survival. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I understood with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to children in crisis that my childhood was over. Whatever innocence I'd managed to preserve after Papa's death had been stripped away in that dark living room with its leather furniture and hunting trophies. Tomorrow would bring new horrors, new secrets to keep, new prices to pay. And there was no one coming to save me. Summer arrived in Cedar Falls with its usual oppressive heat, but for me, every day felt like winter. The weeks following that first horrible afternoon at Frank's house blurred together in a haze of fear and carefully maintained pretense. I learned to live two lives: the public one where I was Margaret Mitchell, a normal 9-year-old girl helping her mother and stepfather-to-be run their household, and the private one where I was Frank Peterson's victim, counting the hours until his next demand for my special attention. Frank was methodical in his approach to my abuse. He never acted impulsively or took unnecessary risks. Instead, he created a schedule of opportunities that seemed natural and innocent to outside observers. Mama's work schedule became the framework for his predations. He knew exactly when she would be tied up with inventory, when she would be helping customers, when she would be too busy to notice my whereabouts. Tuesdays became my day of terror. That was when the fabric store across the street received their weekly shipment, and Mrs. Kowalski always came to the hardware store to borrow Frank's handcart to help move the heavy bolts of material. It gave Frank the perfect excuse to send Mama across the street to help our neighbor, leaving him alone in the store with me. "Margaret can help me organize the stockroom," he would tell Mama, his voice carrying that helpful authority that no one ever questioned. "You go help Edith with those fabric bolts. Take your time. Organization is delicate work." The stockroom was in the back of the hardware store, separated from the main floor by a heavy wooden door that muffled sound. Frank had made it even more isolated by stacking boxes of merchandise in front of the small window that looked out onto the alley. It was like a tomb back there, dark and airless and completely cut off from the world. I learned to dread the sound of that stockroom door closing behind us. Frank would flip the sign to "back in 10 minutes" and lead me through the maze of shelves filled with nails and screws and paint cans, his hand on my shoulder in a grip that looked paternal but felt like a vice. "Time for your lessons, little bird," he would say, using that pet name that made my skin crawl. "You've been good this week, haven't you? You haven't told anyone our special secrets?" I would nod, unable to speak, my throat closed tight with fear and shame. Frank had trained me well in those first few encounters. I knew what he expected, knew the consequences of resistance or delay. The bruises on my arms from his fingers served as constant reminders of what happened to little girls who didn't cooperate. But it wasn't just the physical pain that kept me compliant. Frank was a master of psychological manipulation, constantly reinforcing my helplessness and isolation. He would describe in vivid detail what would happen to Mama and me if I ever told anyone about our special relationship. "Your mama thinks she's so smart, so capable," he would whisper as he hurt me. "But she doesn't understand how the world really works. Women like her, they need men like me to survive. Without my protection, my generosity, she'd be selling herself on street corners just to keep food in your mouth. Is that what you want for her, Margaret? Is that the life you want to condemn her to?" The images he painted were too horrible for a 9-year-old mind to fully process, but I understood enough to know that speaking up would destroy everything Mama had worked so hard to build. Frank owned the building where we lived, held the mortgage on our few possessions, controlled Mama's income and our entire future. One word from him could make us homeless and destitute. Besides, he would continue, adjusting his clothes with that casual efficiency that made everything seem normal and routine. Who would believe you? Look at you, just a skinny little girl with an overactive imagination. Look at me, a respected businessman, a pillar of the community. If you start telling wild stories, people will think you're sick in the head. They'll send you away to one of those hospitals for disturbed children. Is that what you want? I didn't know if such places really existed, but Frank's threats were vivid enough to terrify me. The idea of being separated from Mama, locked away somewhere while she believed I was crazy or lying, was almost worse than enduring the abuse itself. So I stayed silent. I perfected the art of dissociation, of separating my mind from my body during those horrible minutes in the stockroom. I would focus on the dust motes dancing in the thin shaft of light that leaked around the boxes, or count the bolts and screws on the nearest shelf, or recite the multiplication tables Miss Patterson had taught us at school. Anything to keep my consciousness away from what was happening to my physical self. The worst part was afterward, when Frank would smooth down my hair and straighten my dress, transforming me back into the helpful little girl who was just organizing inventory. He would open the stockroom door and call out cheerfully to Mama, who would be returning from her errands across the street. "All done, Rose. Margaret was such a big help. She's getting so responsible. You should be proud of her." And Mama would beam with pride, thanking Frank for taking such an interest in my development, for teaching me the value of hard work and responsibility. She had no idea that her gratitude was like salt in an open wound, that every word of praise for Frank's kindness felt like a betrayal of my suffering. The physical effects of the abuse began to show in ways that Mama attributed to normal childhood development. I lost weight, picking at my food during family dinners while Frank watched me with those calculating eyes. I developed chronic stomach aches that kept me home from school on particularly bad days, though the real sickness was in my soul, not my body. My sleep became fitful and broken, plagued by nightmares that I could never fully remember upon waking. I would sometimes cry out in the night, and Mama would come running to my room, feeling my forehead for fever and asking what had frightened me. "Just bad dreams, Mama," I would tell her. Because how could I explain that my waking life had become the nightmare? "Growing pains," Frank would diagnose, appearing in my doorway with that false concern that made me want to scream. "She's at a difficult age, Rose. Lots of changes happening. She just needs patience and understanding." His ability to explain away every symptom of my distress was almost supernatural. When I flinched away from his casual touches in front of Mama, he would chuckle and comment on how sensitive and dramatic young girls could be. When I stopped laughing at his jokes or participating in family conversations, he would shake his head sadly and talk about how I was becoming moody and withdrawn, typical pre-adolescent behavior that would pass with time and proper guidance. Mama, who had never raised a daughter through this age, accepted his explanations without question. Frank was older, more experienced with children. Didn't he have several nieces and nephews he'd helped raise after his sister died? Surely he understood these developmental phases better than she did. Meanwhile, my performance at school continued to deteriorate. Miss Patterson called Mama in for another conference, expressing concern about my declining grades and increasingly isolated behavior. Margaret used to be one of my brightest students, she told Mama while I sat between them, staring at my hands folded in my lap. Lately, she seems to be somewhere else entirely. She doesn't participate in class discussions, doesn't play with the other children at recess. I'm wondering if there might be something troubling her at home. I looked up sharply, hope flaring in my chest for just a moment. Maybe Miss Patterson could see what Mama couldn't. Maybe she would ask the right questions, create an opening for me to tell the truth. But Mama just sighed and shook her head. We've been through some big changes lately. Frank, Mr. Peterson, has become a very important part of our lives. And I think Margaret is still adjusting to having a father figure around. He says this kind of behavior is normal for girls her age. Miss Patterson looked directly at me. Is that true, Margaret? Are you having trouble adjusting to your new family situation? This was my chance. I could tell her everything about the stockroom, about Frank's threats, about the secret that was eating me alive from the inside. Miss Patterson was young and kind, unmarried with no children of her own, but she had always been fair and protective of her students. But as I opened my mouth to speak, I caught sight of Frank through the classroom window. He was waiting in the hallway, having insisted on driving Mama to the school conference to show his support for Margaret's education. He was watching us through the glass, and when our eyes met, he smiled that cold smile that never reached his eyes. The unspoken threat was clear. If I said anything, if I caused any trouble, Mama would pay the price. We would both pay the price. Yes, Miss Patterson, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm just adjusting. I saw the disappointment in her eyes, the sense that she knew there was more to the story but couldn't force me to tell it. She gave Mama some suggestions about being patient with me, about making sure I felt secure in my changing family dynamic, about perhaps considering counseling if my behavior didn't improve. I appreciate your concern, Mama said, but I think Margaret just needs time. Frank has been wonderful with her, so patient and understanding. I'm sure everything will work out fine. As we left the school that day, Frank's hand settled on my shoulder in what looked like a comforting gesture. But his fingers dug into my collarbone just hard enough to remind me of the consequences of speaking out of turn. You did very well in there, little bird, he murmured, his voice too low for Mama to hear. Miss Patterson seems like a nice lady, but she doesn't understand family matters the way we do. It's better to keep our private business private, don't you think? That night, Frank stayed for dinner as usual, regaling Mama with stories from the hardware store while I pushed food around my plate and tried to disappear into my chair. After the dishes were washed and put away, he announced that he had a surprise for us. I've been thinking about our future, he said, taking Mama's hands in his larger ones. Rose, you and Margaret have become the most important people in my life. I can't imagine living without you both. I watched in horror as he dropped to one knee in our small kitchen, pulling a ring box from his pocket. The diamond was modest but sparkled prettily in the light from the overhead bulb. Rose Mitchell, will you marry me? Mama's gasp of surprise and joy echoed through the kitchen. She said yes, of course, tears of happiness streaming down her face, as Frank slipped the ring onto her finger. They embraced while I sat frozen at the kitchen table, understanding with crystal clarity that this engagement was the final nail in the coffin of my hopes for escape. As Frank's wife, Mama would be even more dependent on him, even more invested in maintaining the illusion of their perfect family. As his stepdaughter, I would be completely under his legal authority, with even fewer protections than I had now. Margaret, come give your new daddy a hug, Frank commanded, opening his arms with that false warmth he'd perfected. I forced myself to stand, forced my feet to carry me across the kitchen, forced my arms to wrap around the man who had stolen my childhood and was now claiming my future. As he held me tight, his lips brushed against my ear. "Welcome to the family, little bird," he whispered, so quietly that only I could hear. "Now we'll never have to be apart." The wedding was planned for September, just 3 months away. 3 months to prepare for a lifetime of being trapped in a house with my abuser. 3 months to watch Mama's happiness grow while my own world crumbled further with each passing day. But even in my darkest moments, some small part of me refused to give up hope entirely. There had to be someone who would listen, someone who would help, someone who would see through Frank's carefully constructed facade. I just had to find them before it was too late. The problem was, time was running out faster than I had ever imagined possible. The summer of 1946 stretched endlessly before me like a prison sentence. With school out and Mama working longer hours to help Frank prepare for their September wedding, I found myself spending more time alone with my tormentor than ever before. Frank had convinced Mama that I was old enough to help around the store during the day instead of being shuffled between neighbors, and she had agreed, proud that her daughter was becoming so responsible and mature. What she didn't know was that those long summer days at Peterson's Hardware had become my personal hell. Frank had refined his methods, becoming bolder and more demanding as he grew confident in my silence. The stockroom sessions became longer and more frequent, and he began requiring me to perform tasks that made me sick to my stomach just thinking about them. "You're becoming quite the little helper," he would say afterward, his voice dripping with that false pride that made me want to scrub my skin raw. "Your mama should be so proud of how grown up you're getting." But the worst part wasn't even the physical abuse anymore. It was the way Frank had begun to twist my mind, making me question my own memories and perceptions. He would describe the things he did to me as normal, as expressions of love and care that all stepfathers shared with their daughters. "This is how families show affection," he would tell me, his hands roaming where they shouldn't. "Your real father would have taught you these things if he hadn't died. I'm just making sure you understand how the world works, how men and women relate to each other." He painted my revulsion and fear as childish ignorance, my tears as evidence of my immaturity. According to Frank, I should be grateful for his education, thankful that he cared enough about my development to take such personal interest in teaching me about adult relationships. "Other girls your age don't have anyone to explain these things to them," he would say. "They have to learn the hard way, from boys who don't care about them, who will use them and throw them away. But you have me. You have someone who loves you enough to be patient, to be gentle, to make sure you understand." The psychological manipulation was perhaps more damaging than the physical abuse. Frank was systematically destroying my ability to trust my own instincts, to distinguish between love and violation, between protection and harm. He was grooming me not just for continued abuse, but for a lifetime of accepting mistreatment as normal. During those endless summer days, I began to exhibit behaviors that would have alarmed any caring adult who knew what to look for. I started hoarding food, hiding scraps of bread and crackers in my bedroom as if preparing for some unnamed catastrophe. I developed nervous habits, picking at my fingernails until they bled, pulling at my hair when I thought no one was looking. Most disturbing of all, I began to self-harm in small ways that I didn't even recognize as such at the time. I would accidentally on purpose bump into sharp corners, leaving bruises on my arms and legs. I would dig my nails into my palms during Frank's lessons, using the pain to anchor myself in reality when everything else felt like a nightmare. The physical symptoms were becoming impossible to ignore. I had lost so much weight that my clothes hung loose on my small frame. Dark circles ringed my eyes from sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, afraid to close my eyes and dream. I had developed a nervous stutter that came and went unpredictably, making it even harder to communicate with the few adults who might have helped me. Mrs. Henderson noticed the changes when I occasionally spent time at Lucy's house. "Margaret seems so thin lately," she mentioned to Mama one Sunday after church. "And she's so quiet. Is everything all right at home?" But Frank was always ready with explanations that sounded perfectly reasonable to adults who had no reason to suspect the truth. "She's going through a growth spurt," he would say with that concerned, paternal tone he'd perfected. "You know how children get when they're growing. All arms and legs, no appetite, moody as the weather. She'll fill out again once she settles into her new height." Or he would blame my behavior on the upcoming wedding. "Margaret's having some anxiety about me marrying her mother," he would explain with what sounded like genuine concern. "She's protective of Rose, wants to make sure I'm going to be a good husband and father. It's actually quite sweet, though it manifests as withdrawal sometimes." These explanations not only deflected suspicion, but actually made Frank look more caring and perceptive. Here was a man who understood child psychology, who was patient with a difficult stepdaughter, who was committed to winning over a grieving child who had lost her father. The adults in our community saw exactly what Frank wanted them to see: a devoted man taking on the challenges of instant fatherhood with grace and wisdom. But I was reaching my breaking point. The constant stress, the ongoing abuse, the psychological manipulation, it was all building toward something that I couldn't name, but could feel approaching like a storm on the horizon. My body was beginning to rebel against the trauma in ways that Frank couldn't control or explain away. The first major incident happened on a sweltering Tuesday in July. Frank had called me into the stockroom for one of his lessons, but this time something was different. Maybe it was the oppressive heat that made the small space feel even more suffocating than usual, or maybe it was simply that my young body and mind had reached their absolute limit. But partway through the abuse, my vision began to tunnel and darken. "Pay attention, little bird," Frank was saying, his voice seeming to come from very far away. "You're being very disrespectful, daydreaming when I'm trying to teach you something important." But I couldn't pay attention. The room was spinning around me, and Frank's face kept blurring in and out of focus. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it might burst from my chest, and I couldn't seem to catch my breath no matter how hard. I tried. "I don't feel good," I managed to whisper. But Frank ignored my words, too focused on his own gratification to notice my distress. The last thing I remember was the taste of copper in my mouth and the sound of my own voice saying, "I can't," before everything went black. I woke up on the stockroom floor with Frank kneeling beside me, his face a mask of panic that I had never seen before. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked genuinely afraid, not of consequences, to himself, but of losing control of the situation entirely. "Margaret! Margaret, wake up!" he was saying, lightly slapping my cheeks. "Come on, little bird. Don't do this to me." When my eyes finally focused on his face, I saw something there. That gave me a tiny spark of hope. For just a moment, Frank Peterson looked like what he really was: a predator who had pushed his victim too far and was now facing the possibility that his carefully constructed world might come crashing down around him. "What happened?" I asked, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "You fainted," Frank said, helping me sit up against a stack of paint cans. "It must be the heat. This stockroom gets like an oven in the summer." But we both knew it wasn't just the heat. My body had finally rebelled against the trauma it was being forced to endure, shutting down to protect itself when my mind couldn't. And if it happened once, it could happen again, potentially at a time and place where Frank couldn't control the narrative. "You can't tell your mama about this," Frank said, his voice carrying a note of desperation I'd never heard before. "She'll just worry unnecessarily. You know how she gets about your health." For the first time in months, I had something that resembled power in this relationship. Frank needed my cooperation now, needed me to help him cover up what had happened. and for just a moment I considered refusing. What if I told Mama that I had fainted in the stockroom? What if I described the circumstances, the way Frank had been teaching me when I lost consciousness? Would she finally ask the right questions? Would she finally see what had been happening right under her nose? But even as the thought formed, I knew I couldn't do it. Frank's threats still held their power over me. Mama was so happy, so excited about the wedding, so grateful for Frank's presence in our lives. How could I destroy all of that based on the word of a disturbed 9-year-old against a respected businessman? I won't tell, I said quietly, and watched relief flood Frank's features. Good girl, he said, helping me to my feet. That's my smart little bird. We understand each other, don't we? But something had changed in that moment when I lay unconscious on the stockroom floor. Frank had shown fear, had revealed that his control wasn't as absolute as he wanted me to believe. And I had felt, for just an instant, what it was like to have power in this relationship, even if it was only the power to cause him momentary panic. The incident marked a turning point in our twisted dynamic. Frank became more cautious after that, shortening our sessions and paying closer attention to my physical responses. He couldn't afford to have me collapse again, especially not with the wedding approaching and increased scrutiny from family and friends. But he also became more psychologically aggressive, as if trying to regain the ground he had lost when I briefly held the upper hand. His threats became more vivid and specific, his descriptions of what would happen to Mama and me if I ever spoke up more detailed and terrifying. Do you know what happens to little girls who tell lies about their stepfathers? He would ask, his voice soft and conversational but his eyes hard as stones. They get sent away to special schools where the teachers don't tolerate nonsense. They get separated from their mothers permanently. They grow up thinking they're crazy because no one believes them. He would describe institutions where troubled children were kept, places with barred windows and locked doors, and doctors who gave injections to make unruly patients quiet and compliant. I didn't know if such places really existed, but Frank's descriptions were convincing enough to terrify me into continued silence. As July gave way to August, the wedding preparations intensified. Mama spent every spare moment working on her dress, a simple but elegant creation in pale blue that made her look younger and happier than I had seen her since Papa died. Frank had insisted on a church ceremony despite the expense, wanting to make their union as public and official as possible. Want the whole town to witness our commitment, he told Mama, but I understood the real message. He wanted everyone to see how legitimate his place in our family was, how natural and right his authority over me would become. The guest list included virtually everyone we knew: neighbors, customers from the hardware store, members of our church congregation. Mrs. Henderson was making the cake, Mrs. Kowalski was providing flowers from her garden, and even Miss Patterson had been invited to celebrate the formation of our new family. I watched the preparations with a growing sense of doom. Each invitation sent, each detail finalized, felt like another bar being added to the cage that would soon lock me in with Frank Peterson for the rest of my childhood. Once he became my legal stepfather, his authority over me would be complete and unquestionable. But as the wedding day approached, that seed of rebellion that had been planted during my fainting spell began to grow. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was simply that I had nothing left to lose. But I started to consider possibilities I had never dared contemplate before. What if I could find a way to stop the wedding? What if I could make people see Frank for what he really was? What if I could finally find the courage to speak the truth, consequences be damned? The plan that began to form in my mind was dangerous and probably hopeless. But it was the only chance I might ever have to save myself and protect Mama from binding herself legally to a monster. Time was running out, but I still had 3 weeks until the wedding. 3 weeks to find a way to expose Frank Peterson and stop him from completing his capture of our family. It wasn't much time, but it was all I had. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something I had almost forgotten existed, a tiny flicker of hope. The idea came to me during Sunday service, 3 weeks before the wedding. Pastor Williams was delivering a sermon about bearing witness to truth, about speaking up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. His words seemed to penetrate the fog of fear and despair that had clouded my thinking for so long, and suddenly I knew what I had to do. Frank was sitting beside me in the pew, his hand resting possessively on my shoulder while Mama beamed beside him, admiring her engagement ring as it caught the colored light from the stained glass windows. To everyone around us, we looked like the perfect soon-to-be family, a successful businessman, his devoted fiancée, and her sweet daughter who would benefit so much from having a strong father figure in her life. But as Pastor Williams spoke, about courage in the face of adversity, about standing up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible, I felt something stir inside me that I hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't hope exactly. That seemed too fragile, too dangerous to entertain. It was more like determination, cold and hard and focused on a single goal: stopping Frank Peterson before he could legally cement his control over my life. The plan that formed in my mind was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. I would tell someone the truth, not just anyone, but someone with enough authority and credibility to be believed, someone who could investigate my claims and potentially stop the wedding. The question was who. Miss Patterson was too young and had no real power beyond her classroom. Mrs. Henderson meant well, but she was just a neighbor with no special influence. Dr. Whitmore, our family physician, might listen, but Frank had already poisoned that well by describing me as a difficult child going through adjustment problems. Then I remembered someone I hadn't thought of in months: Sheriff Douglas Hayes. He had been Papa's friend, a man who had attended Papa's funeral and had sometimes stopped by our house in the early days after Papa's death to check on us. More importantly, he was the law in Cedar Falls, someone with both the authority to investigate serious allegations and the obligation to protect children from harm. The challenge would be getting to him without Frank knowing. The sheriff's office was located in the basement of the town hall, just 2 blocks from the hardware store. But Frank seemed to have an uncanny ability to know where I was at all times, and his network of friends and customers meant that someone would inevitably mention seeing me somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I needed a plan that would get me to Sheriff Hayes without arousing Frank's suspicion, and I needed it to happen soon. Every day that passed brought the wedding closer and made my situation more desperate. Once Frank became my legal stepfather, who would believe the word of a troubled child against her own family? The opportunity came on a sweltering Thursday afternoon in late August. Mama had developed a severe headache and asked Frank if she could go home early to lie down in a dark room. Frank, playing the concerned fiancé perfectly, immediately insisted that she take the rest of the day off. "Margaret and I can handle things here," he assured her, his voice full of that false kindness that made my skin crawl. "You go home and rest. We'll close up shop and be along shortly." My heart sank as I realized what this meant. An afternoon alone with Frank, probably another lesson in the stockroom, another opportunity for him to remind me of my powerlessness. But then I noticed something that gave me a spark of hope. Frank had received a delivery notification that morning for a large shipment of farming equipment that needed to be unloaded and inventoried. It was the kind of job that would keep him busy for at least an hour, possibly longer. "Mr. Peterson," I said, trying to keep my voice casual and helpful, "shouldn't we get that farming equipment unloaded before it gets too hot this afternoon? The delivery truck is supposed to come at 3 o'clock. Frank glanced at the clock on the wall, which showed 2:15. He looked annoyed at being reminded of his responsibilities when he had other plans, but he couldn't argue with the logic. The equipment needed to be dealt with, and the afternoon heat would only make the job more unpleasant if they delayed. "You're right," he said grudgingly. "I suppose we should handle that first. You can help me with the inventory sheets once everything's unloaded." But I had no intention of being there for the inventory. As soon as the delivery truck arrived and Frank became absorbed in directing the unloading process, I slipped out the back door of the hardware store and ran through the alleyways toward the town hall. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears as I descended the narrow staircase to the sheriff's office. The basement was cool and dim after the blazing heat outside, and it took my eyes a moment to adjust. Sheriff Hayes was sitting at his desk, reading through some paperwork, when I knocked timidly on his open door. "Well, hello there, Margaret," he said, looking up with surprise. Sheriff Hayes was a large man with kind eyes and graying hair, probably in his 50s. He had always been gentle with me during the few times our paths had crossed since Papa's death. "What brings you down here today?" I stood in his doorway, suddenly unable to speak. All the words I had rehearsed, all the courage I had mustered during the run through the alleys, seemed to desert me in the face of actually having to tell my story. How could I explain what Frank had been doing to me? How could I make this good? Man, understand the horror of my situation without dying of shame in the process? I need to tell you something," I finally managed, my voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear me. "About Frank Peterson." Something in my tone must have alerted him that this was serious, because his expression immediately became more focused and professional. "Come in and sit down, Margaret. Take your time." I perched on the edge of the chair across from his desk, my hands twisted together in my lap, trying to find the words that would make him believe me. "He's going to marry my mama," I said, starting with the one fact that everyone in town already knew. "Yes, I heard about the engagement. That's wonderful news for your family," Sheriff Hayes said carefully. "Frank's a good man. Your mother is lucky to have found someone willing to take care of both of you." The automatic praise of Frank's character hit me like a physical blow. Even Sheriff Hayes, a man whose job it was to see through lies and deception, had been completely fooled by Frank's public persona. "He's not good," I whispered, the words barely audible. "He hurts me." Sheriff Hayes's expression sharpened immediately. "What do you mean he hurts you? Has he hit you, Margaret?" I shook my head, unable to meet his eyes. Not like that. He touches me. In places he shouldn't. He makes me do things." My voice trailed off as shame and embarrassment threatened to overwhelm me. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. When I finally found the courage to look up at Sheriff Hayes, I saw a mixture of concern and skepticism in his expression that made my heart sink. "Margaret," he said gently, "these are very serious accusations you're making. Are you absolutely certain about what you're telling me? Sometimes children can misinterpret adult behavior, especially when they're dealing with big changes in their family situation." "I'm not misinterpreting anything," I said, my voice growing stronger with desperation. "He takes me into the stockroom at the hardware store when Mama's not looking. He says it's our special secret, that no one would believe me if I told. He says if I tell anyone, he'll send Mama and me away and we'll be homeless." Sheriff Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying my face with the intense scrutiny of someone trying to determine if a witness was telling the truth. "When did this alleged behavior start, Margaret?" "After he started courting Mama. First it was just little things, but then it got worse. And now," I took a shaky breath, "now he's going to be my stepfather, and I'll never be able to get away from him." "These are very serious charges," Sheriff Hayes said slowly. "If what you're telling me is true, then Frank Peterson has committed crimes that would send him to prison for a very long time. But I need you to understand that false accusations can also have serious consequences. Are you absolutely sure you're not confused or perhaps angry about your mother's engagement?" The question hit me like a slap. Even now, even when I had finally found the courage to speak the truth, the first response was to doubt my word, to suggest that I was lying or confused or acting out of childish spite. "I'm not lying," I said, tears starting to flow down my cheeks. "I know how it sounds. I know no one wants to believe it. But I'm telling the truth. Frank Peterson is a bad man, and if my mama marries him, he's going to keep hurting me forever. Sheriff, Hayes reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a clean handkerchief, handing it to me with a gentle expression. I'm not saying you're lying, Margaret, but I need you to understand that this is a very serious matter that requires careful investigation. I can't just take your word and arrest a respected businessman without evidence. What kind of evidence? I asked, wiping my eyes with his handkerchief. He doesn't hurt me where anyone can see the marks. He's too smart for that. Well, there would need to be corroborating evidence. Has anyone else witnessed this behavior? Have you told anyone else about it? I shook my head miserably. Sure, I couldn't tell anyone. He says Mama won't believe me, that everyone will think I'm crazy or lying. He says he'll destroy our lives if I tell. Sheriff Hayes was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the dilemma of a child making serious accusations against a pillar of the community with no evidence to support her claims. When he spoke again, his voice was kind but firm. Margaret, I want you to know that I take what you've told me very seriously. If Frank Peterson is indeed doing what you say he's doing, then he needs to be stopped. But I also need you to understand that I can't act on accusations alone, especially when they're made by a child against a well-respected adult. My heart was sinking rapidly. I could see where this was going, could feel my one chance at salvation slipping away through my fingers like water. However, Sheriff Hayes continued, I think the best thing to do right now is to have a conversation with your mother. If we can sit down together, you, me, and your mama, and discuss this situation openly, maybe we can get to the bottom of what's really happening. No! The word burst out of me with more force than I intended. You can't tell Mama! Frank! Well, no, I talked to you, and he'll make everything worse. Please, you have to believe me without telling her. But Sheriff Hayes was already shaking his head. I'm sorry, Margaret, but I can't investigate these allegations without involving your mother. She has a right to know what you're saying about the man she's planning to marry. And frankly, if these accusations are true, she needs to know in order to protect you. I stared at him in horror, realizing that my desperate gambit had not only failed, but had actually made my situation worse. Now Frank would know that I had tried to expose him, and his revenge would be swift and terrible. When? I whispered. I think we should do this as soon as possible, Sheriff Hayes said. How about if I come by your house this evening? We can sit down as a family and discuss everything openly. As he spoke, I heard footsteps on the stairs outside his office, heavy boots that I recognized immediately. My blood turned to ice as Frank Peterson appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of false concern that didn't quite hide the rage burning in his eyes. Margaret! There you are, he said, his voice carrying just the right note of worried relief. When I realized you were missing from the store, I was so worried. I've been looking everywhere for you. He stepped into the office, filling the small space with his presence and effectively blocking my path to the door. Sheriff Hayes, I hope Margaret hasn't been bothering you with any of her stories. She's been having some behavioral problems. Lately, anxiety about the wedding, you understand. Her teacher says children sometimes act out when they're dealing with family changes. I watched in despair as Sheriff Hayes's expression shifted, the doubt I had been fighting against crystallizing into something approaching certainty. Here was the respected businessman, the concerned stepfather-to-be, searching for his troubled stepdaughter who had run off and was apparently telling wild stories to the local sheriff. Actually, Frank, Sheriff Hayes said, standing up from his desk, Margaret and I were just having a conversation that I think we should continue with her mother present. Would this evening be convenient for you? Frank's smile never wavered, but I saw his knuckles whiten as his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Of course, Sheriff. Whatever Margaret needs to feel secure in our family situation. You know how important her well-being is to Rose and me. As we left the sheriff's office together, Frank's hand settled on my shoulder in what looked like a protective gesture, but felt like the grip of an executioner. I had played my last card and lost. Now there was nothing left to do but wait for the consequences of my desperate gamble to unfold. The wedding was still 2 weeks away, but I knew with terrible certainty that those might be the last 2 weeks of relative safety I would ever have. After tonight's meeting with Sheriff Hayes, Frank would know exactly how much I had told and how much I was willing to risk to escape him, and his response to that knowledge would determine whether I survived long enough to see my 10th birthday. The ride home from the sheriff's office was the longest 10 minutes of my life. Frank drove in silence, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. His hands gripped the steering wheel with such force that his knuckles had gone completely white, and I found myself pressing against the passenger door, trying to put as much distance between us as possible in the confined space of the truck. Cab. When we pulled into our driveway, Frank sat motionless for a moment, staring straight ahead through the windshield. Then, without warning, he turned to face me, and the look in his eyes made me understand what prey animals must feel like in the moments before a predator strikes. "You stupid little girl," he said, his voice so quiet and controlled that it was more terrifying than any shout could have been. "Did you really think you could outsmart me? Did you think I wouldn't find out?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My throat felt like it had been filled with sand, and my heart was beating so fast I thought it might burst from my chest. "I know exactly what you told Sheriff Hayes," Frank continued, leaning closer until I could smell the coffee on his breath mixed with something else. Something sour and predatory that made my stomach turn. Every pathetic, lying word. "And do you know what's going to happen now?" I shook my head, unable to speak. Frank's smile was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. Cold and calculating, and completely devoid of any human warmth. "Now you're going to learn what happens to little girls who don't appreciate the good things in their lives. Who bite the hand that feeds them. Who try to destroy the people who love them." He got out of the truck and came around to my side, opening the door with exaggerated courtesy. "Come along, Margaret. Your mother is waiting inside and we have some family business to discuss before Sheriff Hayes arrives this evening." The walk from the truck to our front door felt like a death march. Each step brought me closer to a confrontation I knew I couldn't win. A reckoning that had been building since the first time Frank Peterson had laid his hands on me in that dark stockroom. Mama was in the kitchen when we entered, still wearing the damp cloth she'd been using to ease her headache. She looked up when we walked in, and I saw immediately that Frank had already poisoned the well during whatever conversation they'd had while I was at the sheriff's office. "Margaret Ann Mitchell," she said, using my full name in a tone I hadn't heard since I was much younger and had broken one of her prized dishes. "Frank tells me you ran off from the store this afternoon without permission. He was worried sick about you." "Mama, I need to tell you," I began, but Frank cut me off with a gesture. "I think Margaret has already done enough talking for one day," he said, his voice carrying that false paternal authority that had convinced so many people he was a good man. "Rose, we need to discuss what she told Sheriff Hayes." Mama's expression shifted from annoyance to concern. "What do you mean? What did she tell him?" Frank settled into Papa's old chair at the kitchen table, a presumption that felt like another violation, and gestured for Mama and me to sit as well. I remained standing near the door, every instinct screaming at me to run, but knowing there was nowhere to go. "Our daughter has been telling some very disturbing stories," Frank said, the possessive "our" making my skin crawl. "Stories about me, about our family, about things that supposedly happened between us." I watched Mama's face as understanding dawned, saw the color drain from her cheeks as she began to comprehend what Frank was suggesting. "What kind of stories?" "The kind that could destroy a man's reputation," Frank replied, his eyes never leaving my face. "The kind that troubled children sometimes make up when they're feeling confused or angry about changes in their family situation." "That's not true." The words burst out of me before I could stop them. Mama, I'm not making anything up. Frank has been— Enough! Frank's voice cracked like a whip, and I flinched backward. You see what I mean, Rose? The child is completely out of control. She's been spiraling for weeks now, and I've tried to be patient, tried to understand that she's grieving and adjusting. But this has gone too far. Mama looked between us, confusion and distress written clearly across her features. Margaret, what exactly did you tell Sheriff Hayes? This was my moment, perhaps the last chance I would ever have to make her understand the truth. I took a deep breath and forced myself to speak clearly and calmly, despite the terror coursing through my veins. I told him that Frank touches me when you're not around, I said, watching my mother's face for any sign that she believed me. In the stockroom at the hardware store, he makes me do things, bad things. And he said if I ever told anyone, he would send us away and we'd have nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. Mama stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. Horror, disbelief, confusion all warring for dominance on her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Margaret, do you understand what you're saying? Do you understand how serious these accusations are? I understand, I said, tears starting to flow down my cheeks. I know it sounds crazy. I know you don't want to believe it, but it's true. Frank is not the man you think he is. Frank leaned forward, his expression a perfect mask of hurt and concern. Rose, I want you to know that I don't blame Margaret for this. She's been through so much trauma, losing her father, adjusting to having me in her life. Sometimes children create elaborate fantasies to cope with situations they don't understand. I'm not creating fantasies, I shouted, desperation making my voice crack. Mama, please, you have to believe me. He's been hurting me for months, and if you marry him, it's only going to get worse. But even as I spoke, I could see the doubt in Mama's eyes. Frank had done his work too well, had positioned himself too perfectly as the savior of our family. The idea that this good man, this generous benefactor who had rescued us from poverty and despair, could be capable of such evil, was simply too much for her to accept. Margaret, Mama said slowly, I think you need to really think about what you're saying. Frank has been nothing but kind to us. He's given us a home, a livelihood, a future. Why would you want to destroy that with these horrible lies? The word lies hit me like a physical blow. In that moment, I understood with crystal clarity that I had lost. Frank's manipulation had been too thorough, his campaign to discredit me too effective. Even my own mother couldn't bring herself to believe that the man she loved was capable of such monstrous behavior. They're not lies, I whispered. But the fight had gone out of me. What was the point of continuing to argue when the person who should have protected me above all others had already chosen her abuser over her child? Frank stood up from the table, moving to stand behind Mama's chair with his hands on her shoulders, in a gesture that looked comforting but felt possessive. Rose, I think Margaret needs help. Professional help. There are doctors who specialize in children who have been through trauma, who can help her work through these confused feelings. What kind of doctors? Mama asked, looking up at him with complete trust. Child psychiatrists. They have facilities where disturbed children can receive intensive treatment, where they can learn to distinguish between reality and fantasy. I've been doing some research since Margaret's behavior became so concerning. The threat was unmistakable, though carefully disguised as concerned care. Frank was suggesting that I be sent away to some kind of mental institution, locked up with doctors who would cure me of my inconvenient truth-telling. And Mama, in her desperation to believe in the fantasy of our perfect new family, was actually considering it. I don't need doctors, I said, backing further toward the door. I need you to believe me. I need you to protect me. But Mama was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. Margaret, I don't know what's gotten into you. Frank has been nothing but good to us. He saved us when we had nothing. How can you say such terrible things about him? Because they're true, I screamed, all pretense of calm abandoned. Because he's been hurting me and threatening me and making my life a nightmare. And you're so grateful to him that you can't see what's right in front of your face. The sound of my own voice echoing through the kitchen seemed to snap something inside me. All the months of silence, of swallowed fear and suppressed rage, came pouring out in a torrent of words that I couldn't stop. He takes me to the stockroom and he puts his hands where they don't belong. He tells me it's normal, that it's what stepfathers do, that I should be grateful for his attention. He says if I tell anyone, you won't believe me, and he was right. You're choosing him over me just like he said you would. Margaret, stop it! Mama was on her feet now, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. I will not listen to another word of this nonsense. You will apologize to Frank right now for these horrible accusations. I stared at her in disbelief. Even now, even after I had laid my soul bare and told her the truth about what had been happening to me, she was demanding that I apologize to my abuser. I won't, I said quietly. I won't apologize for telling the truth. Frank's expression shifted subtly, and I saw a flash of the real man beneath the mask, cold, calculating, and utterly without remorse. Rose. I think Margaret has made her position very clear. Perhaps it would be best if she spent some time in her room thinking about the consequences of her behavior. Sheriff Hayes will be here soon, and we need to discuss how to handle this situation. Yes, Mama said, her voice shaking with emotion. Go to your room, Margaret, and don't come out until you're ready to apologize for these terrible lies. I looked at her for a long moment, memorizing her face, understanding that something fundamental had broken between us that could never be repaired. She had made her choice, and it wasn't me. Without another word, I turned and walked up the stairs to my room, closing the door behind me with a soft click. Through the thin walls, I could hear their voices below, Frank's calm and reasonable, Mama's distressed and confused. He was spinning his web even tighter, convincing her that I was disturbed, that I needed help, that the best thing for everyone would be to have me quietly committed somewhere far away. I sat on my bed and waited for Sheriff Hayes to arrive, knowing that the meeting would be a formality. Frank had already won. With Mama's support and his own reputation as a shield, he would easily convince the sheriff that I was a troubled child making up stories for attention. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness, something unexpected happened. Instead of despair, I felt a strange sense of clarity settle over me. I had told the truth. I had done everything I could to save myself and protect my mother from making a terrible mistake. If they chose not to believe me, if they chose to side with a monster over an innocent child, then I would have to find another way to survive. Didn't know what that way might be, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not go quietly to whatever institution Frank had planned for me. I would not disappear conveniently into the shadows while he completed his destruction of my family. Somehow, some way, I would find a way to expose Frank Peterson for what he really was. And if I couldn't save myself, maybe I could at least save the next little girl who crossed his path. The sound of Sheriff Hayes's car in the driveway interrupted my thoughts. The final act of this terrible drama was about to begin, and I steeled myself for whatever came next. Because even though I had lost this battle, the war wasn't over yet. The meeting with Sheriff Hayes went exactly as I had expected. Sitting in our living room with Mama on one side and Frank on the other, I watched helplessly as my abuser masterfully manipulated the conversation. Frank painted me as a troubled child struggling with the loss of my father and the prospect of gaining a stepfather. He spoke with such convincing concern about my behavioral changes and worrying fantasies that even I almost began to doubt my own memories. Sheriff Hayes listened politely to my tearful retelling of the abuse, but I could see in his eyes that Frank's reputation and Mama's support had already sealed my fate. When I finished speaking, the sheriff turned to Frank with an apologetic expression. I'm sorry you've had to deal with this, Frank. Children who've experienced trauma sometimes create elaborate stories to cope with their feelings of powerlessness. I don't blame Margaret, Frank replied with perfect false compassion. She's been through so much. Rose and I just want to get her the help she needs. Within an hour, it was decided. I would be sent to a special school in Columbus for emotionally disturbed children, where I could receive proper care for my condition. The wedding would proceed as planned, and everyone agreed it would be best if I wasn't there to upset myself further with the celebration. But as Sheriff Hayes was leaving, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Henderson appeared at our front door, carrying a covered dish and wearing an expression of gentle concern. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I brought some soup for Rose's headache. I saw the sheriff's car and wondered if everything was all right." "Everything's fine, Edith," Frank said quickly, moving to block her view into the house. "Just some family business to sort out." But Mrs. Henderson had already seen me sitting on the stairs, and something in my expression must have alarmed her. "Margaret, dear, you look so pale. Are you feeling well?" Before Frank could stop me, I stood up and walked to Mrs. Henderson. Looking directly into her kind eyes, I said the words that would change everything. "Mrs. Henderson, Frank Peterson has been hurting me, and they're sending me away so I can't tell anyone else." The silence that followed was electric. Frank's face went white, then red, then white again. Mama gasped as if I had struck her, but Mrs. Henderson simply looked at me with the focused attention of someone who understood that a child's life hung in the balance. "What kind of hurting, Margaret?" she asked quietly. Frank stepped forward, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Edith, Margaret has been having some psychological problems. She's been making up stories." "I wasn't speaking to you, Frank." "Peterson," Mrs. Henderson said sharply, and I had never heard such steel in her voice before. "I was speaking to this child. Margaret, tell me exactly what happened." So I did. Standing there in our living room, with Frank's fury radiating beside me and Mama's shocked sobs filling the air, I told Mrs. Henderson everything. About the stockroom, about the threats, about months of abuse disguised as lessons and special attention. When I finished, Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something that no other adult had done. She believed me completely and immediately. "Sheriff Hayes," she said, turning to the lawman who had been preparing to leave, "I think you need to hear something. Last month, my Lucy told me that Mr. Peterson had been asking her strange questions when she came to the hardware store. Personal. Questions about her body, about whether she was developing yet. I thought it was odd, but I didn't want to assume the worst. She's obviously coaching the children," Frank sputtered, but his confidence was cracking. "And 3 weeks ago," Mrs. Henderson continued, "I saw Margaret come out of that stockroom looking like she'd seen a ghost. Her dress was wrinkled, her hair was messed up, and she had what looked like finger marks on her arm. I should have said something then." Sheriff Hayes's expression had changed completely. The polite skepticism was gone, replaced by the sharp focus of a lawman who suddenly understood he might have almost let a predator slip through his fingers. "Frank Peterson," he said formally, "I think we need to continue this conversation at my office." What followed happened very quickly. Frank was arrested that same night. A search of his house revealed a collection of photographs that made seasoned investigators sick to their stomachs. Images of local children in various states of undress, taken without their knowledge during supposed inventory help sessions. At the store, more victims came forward once Frank was in custody. Lucy Henderson admitted that he had touched her inappropriately during a visit to the store. 2 other girls from town revealed similar experiences. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Frank Peterson was convicted on multiple counts of child abuse and sentenced to 15 years in the state penitentiary. The wedding, of course, never happened. Mama took months to recover from the shock of learning that the man she'd planned to marry was a monster who had been abusing her daughter. She spent many nights crying and apologizing, begging my forgiveness, for not protecting me, for not believing me when I tried to tell her the truth. Our relationship was damaged, probably forever. I forgave her because she was my mother, and because I understood that Frank had manipulated her as expertly as he had manipulated everyone else. But trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. Even now, all these years later, I remember the moment she chose him over me. We moved away from Cedar Falls 6 months later. Mama sold the hardware store and used the money to start fresh in a bigger town where no one knew our story. I finished growing up there, went to college, became a teacher myself. I married a good man named Margaret Thompson when I was 25, and we had 3 children together. I never saw Frank Peterson again after his trial, but I heard he died in prison in 1963, 17 years into his sentence. I felt no satisfaction at the news, only a quiet relief that he could never hurt another child. The scars he left on me never fully healed. Even now, at 87, I sometimes wake up from dreams about that stockroom, about the feeling of being trapped and helpless while a monster pretended to care about me. I learned to live with those scars, but they shaped who I became and how I raised my own children. I'm telling this story now because Mrs. Henderson's courage in believing me, in speaking up when she saw the signs, saved my life. If not for her willingness to trust a child's word over an adult's reputation, I might have disappeared into that special school and never been heard from again. There are children out there right now who are living through what I lived through. They're scared, they're alone, and they're convinced that no one will believe them if they speak up. Some of them might be watching this video, hoping against hope that someone will finally hear them. To those children, I want you to know this: your voice matters. Your truth matters. There are adults in this world who will believe you and fight for you, even when it seems like everyone else has failed you. Don't give up. Keep speaking your truth until someone listens. And to the adults watching this, pay attention to the children in your life. Look for the signs I showed: withdrawal, fear, sudden changes in behavior, reluctance to be alone with certain adults. Don't assume a child is lying or confused just because the person they're accusing seems respectable. Predators are experts at hiding in plain sight. Be the Mrs. Henderson in a child's life. Be the adult who listens, who believes, who acts. You might be the only thing standing between a child and years of suffering. My name is Margaret Thompson, and this is my story. Thank you for listening, and for helping me transform the worst experience of my childhood into something that might protect other children from the same fate. The monsters are real, but so are the heroes. Sometimes they're the same person, someone who finds the courage to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. That's how we survive. That's how we heal. And that's how we make sure the next generation is safer than we were. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.